So I'd like to welcome you to Provocation number 8, Beyond Fairness, Reclaiming Assessment for Justice, with the very lovely Jan McArthur. So first of all, we'll start with an acknowledgement of country. And our beautiful country, we had rain yesterday, we had virtually spring-like weather today and due for rain the next couple of days. So country is enjoying the showers, but then enjoying the sunshine after it, which will promote beautiful growth. And certainly represents where our campus footprint, from Sydney to the Southern Highlands to the South Coast, from freshwater to bitter water to salt, from city to urban to rural. So we're very glad that you can join us today. We're coming from Dharawal country, but we welcome you from whichever country or land that you are on at the present time. So hand over to Elise.
Thank you, Anne. And today is an exciting chapter in our provocation journey together. We've saved the best for last. We have a wonderful provocation today, Beyond Fairness, Reclaiming Assessment for Justice. So while there aren't any more provocations to register for, we do encourage those of you who haven't perhaps been able to make it to some of the sessions to interact with the recordings of those sessions. And we will actually be meeting as a think tank. So the Assessment Reimagined think tank is meeting via a series of workshops that take place from next Monday onwards. So we will actually be diving deeper to unpack some of the emerging themes and ideas that we have been prompted or provoked into exploring, perhaps. So thank you to everybody who has joined us for some or many of the sessions to date. And today promises to also be another wonderful session that to conclude our series with. So I have the pleasure now of welcoming our final provocateur, if have I got that pronunciation right? We are joined today by Professor Jan McArthur. And one moment, Jan is joining us from Lancaster University in the UK, where I believe, what time is it this morning there at the moment, Jan?
It's just gone 7 o'clock in the morning.
7 o'clock in the morning. So thank you so much for joining us so early in the morning as well. Professor Jan McArthur is the head of the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University and a leading scholar in higher education and social justice. Her research explores the intersection of critical theory, pedagogy and assessment, with a particular focus on the moral and relational dimensions of learning. And her book, Assessment for Social Justice, has shaped international conversations on how universities can align educational practices with values of inclusion, purpose and human flourishing. So please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Jan McArthur. I'll hand it over to you, Jan.
Well, I want to thank you very much for this kind information, for this kind invitation, and for Anne and Alice for organising this event. I want to say how much I admire the project that you're undertaking at Wollongong and the commitment and thoroughness with which you are rethinking assessment. And I also want to say how much I admire the bravery of ending the provocations with the topic of justice. And it really delighted me to see you do that. I'm going to just give a few words of introduction about myself, then some introductory thoughts, and then move into sort of the sections of the presentation or the provocation, and I'll explain them as we go. And the idea is to have an interactive session where we pause for chats every so often. Obviously, this is my provocation, so this is me saying the things I desperately want to say, but they're not things you have to agree with. They're just things that hopefully will inspire your thinking and take it in interesting directions, and directions that are good for you, that are good for your students. So just by way of background, oops, it's not moving on. There we go. So I'm from Melbourne. I don't know whether you can hear it in my accent anymore. It's a bit of a muddled accent. But I went to Monash University. I now work at Lancaster University, which is in the northwest of England. But I live in the Scottish borders, and so this is my garden at the moment. It's spring and everything's colourful and lovely. But my favourite place in the world, part of Australia, is the Murray River, where my father grew up. So this is my special happy place to swim in the Murray, however cold it is. And the other thing to tell you by way of background is that I'm a Collingwood supporter. Now, I realise at this point, I saw Alice's face. Oh, dear. So why do I share this important fact with you, knowing that I've just lost about 95% of the people on the call? Well, I do it because Collingwood, so I'm third generation Collingwood supporter. My grandfather got off the boat from Scotland and went straight to the Collingwood football ground. That's the family legend. So I'm the worst sort. But we are known by people as being very black and white in our thinking, Collingwood good, everyone else bad. And same goes the other way. Everyone thinks that Collingwood's bad. And so I want to begin this idea of this sort of black and white thinking and say that when it comes to a bold change initiative such as you have, we really need to be careful about othering our colleagues into camps of being either for or against change. And the idea that, you have the visionaries, and if you're not a visionary, then you're just a stick in the mud, and that you're either dynamic or you're moribund, or you're reckless or responsible. And that these ways of thinking about for and against change aren't really helpful. But we also have to be sympathetic to why people sometimes seem to fall into these camps, because of the uncertainty and the challenges of any bold change initiative. And so I have some questions that I want to suggest that you might ask yourself. And maybe many of you are like me and you don't see yourself in either of these camps. But if you do, and this is just in your own private moments, you don't have to admit it, if you are an enthusiast for change, perhaps consider, are you clear-sighted about what is motivating your desire for change? We all know there are people who just like picking up new shiny things, and that's not what we need in the current circumstances. Have you reflected on past experiences of change, especially in the assessment context? Because have they always made things better? Well, of course, we know, no, they haven't. Some changes have not been helpful. How will you evaluate whether the proposed changes make a positive difference? Because you have to have a plan of evaluation right from the start if you're going to know that you've covered some distance. And are you compassionate, kind and generous to those less convinced of the need to change? Those so-called stick in the muds. And the doubters about change, perhaps you ask yourselves, can you articulate clear arguments against the proposed changes? Or are you taking what seems the easiest route, i.e. to do nothing? Have you generously listened to the arguments for change? Or have they frightened you, confused you, and you've just closed your ears to them? Do you think the current situation is in the best interests of staff, students, and the wider purposes of higher education? So is everything all right as is? In which case, fine, don't change. But I don't know a single person who thinks everything's absolutely okie dokie in the world of higher education at the moment. And can you find constructive ways to share your doubts, concerns, and alternative visions? If you feel you're not being heard, perhaps it's about changing the way in which you articulate concerns. And the reason this is all important, I'm going to use what might seem a very dramatic example, but there's a fabulous book written about the Challenger disaster. And, I'm of an age I can remember waking up in the morning and my mum telling me this terrible thing had happened. And in this book, Diane Vaughan goes to quite a lengthy exploration of what went wrong. And near the end, she makes this observation. The Challenger disaster was an accident, the result of a mistake. What is important to remember from this case is not that individuals in organisations make mistakes, but the mistakes themselves are socially organised and systematically produced. So all the evidence that this was going to go wrong, that people were going to die, was there. But the structure of the organisation led to this tragic mistake. And that's a hard thing to think about as an organisation. And we might think this isn't about life and death, but actually, sometimes it is. But it's also about human flourishing and well-being. And that's really important too. And so, sorry, from that slightly grim, but I think important observation, as we go through this workshop together, and particularly as we stop to use the chat or the Q&A forums, and I've divided the talk into 4 sections, and I'm going to pause after each section. But what I want is very much everyone here on this call to leave the session with something, be it a new question, be it something you want to investigate further, or just something that someone you want to reach out to and have a cuppa and a chat with. And maybe if you're one of those doubters, maybe you could reach out to one of the enthusiasts who've been driving you mad and actually have a cuppa and a chat and try and understand it from their perspective, and vice versa. Because I think that's really important to this really, as I keep saying, bold initiative that your university is enabling you to participate in. So, oops, I've already missed my own cue. There was meant to be, no, I'm sorry, I've got myself muddled. Let me go on. So here's part 1. My part 1 is I just got some sort of general random thoughts on top of those I've already had to sort of set the scene for our thinking together today. And this is my first in terms of generative AI, which clearly is at the heart of your Renaissance project. How we respond to generative artificial intelligence and how we nurture holistic and authentic assessment must rest on values and principles that we should have attended to long before generative artificial intelligence. The world of assessment was not all fine and good before Gen AI came on the scene. And we can't simply think that Gen AI will fix that. We actually have to go back to those values and principles that we should have had straighter and clearer, where we should have enabled a stronger commitment to, particularly in terms of social justice, be it for staff, students, and wider society, before we even begin. And when we talk about justice and injustice, an important lesson from the critical theory, which I draw on a lot, is that injustice is often hidden in plain sight. And that's going to be one of your greatest challenges navigating, that the injustices that you seek to remedy can be there hidden in plain sight. So here's a few examples. From To Kill a Mockingbird, an obvious one. This is a courtroom. This should be the quintessential place of justice, shouldn't it? The courtroom. But hidden in plain sight is the injustice of this black man with his all-white jury and the white judge and the lawyer, even in his case, a good lawyer, but they're still all white. He's being judged in a white world as a black man. To a more prosaic example, this advertisement from the 1950s, ways to please a lady, buy her a toaster. There you go. That's a good ad, isn't it? And if she's really good, you could get her a pressure cooker. Now, this might seem harmless fun, but actually in this ad is hidden in plain sight all sorts of gender stereotypes and even the potential for misogyny that needed to be addressed. An example from today, which I think will resonate with you in Australia, the British Broadcasting Commission. So the BBC, meant to be the great impartial news service. This is a typical headline at the moment. UK pledges 84 million to stop illegal migration at source. Hidden in plain sight there, though, is the injustice that what they're actually referring to are refugees. And refugees are not illegal migrants. But hidden in plain sight, perpetuating injustice against vulnerable people is this headline, taken as just fact. So you may wonder why on my title slide, I had this painting. Well, I'm trying to get in the vibe of Renaissance. And so this is one of my favourite Renaissance painters, Artemisia Gentileschi. Now, I first came to know her work through a book by Germaine Greer. Now, I have to say, there's a lot that Germaine Greer has said of late that I would put a big river between me and her. But going back to this book, an early work, it's a really fascinating account of her argument as to why we don't have all these great female artists in the past. And she goes through a series of obstacles that have prevented women flourishing. And one of them is flattery. And this is the one I always find really, really interesting, because I sometimes wonder if we, for all the best reasons, confuse collegiality with flattery. In that a colleague is in a meeting, comes up with an idea and you say, oh, that's a really good idea. That's really interesting. But actually, you don't think it is. You think it's got some real problems and dangers. But you want to be collegial. And so it seems collegial to say, oh, yeah, good idea. All ideas are equal here. And I know Anne is particularly skilled and has done a lot of work on ethical conversations. And how is it that we have these conversations that we can be collegial without falling into the realm of flattery, which just stultifies growth because you don't push anybody any further. And Germaine Greer refers to Gentileschi as the magnificent exception. Now, a lot of other feminist art historians have since taken exception to this idea, but I sort of like it in that I want to present her as, if you like, an idea of edgy Renaissance, because I really buy into this idea of Renaissance that you have in your project. But there could be the Renaissance of all those boring white men and just blah, 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 having, you know, paintings of wars and whatever. But with Gentileschi's work, we have this idea of edgy Renaissance. And I want to show it to you by one of her most famous paintings. This is Judith killing Holofernes. So this is, from her perspective, an act of justice. She's saving her people from this tyrant. But more famous than her painting is this one by Renaissance bad boy Caravaggio. Can you see the difference in the way the women are depicted in these two paintings? Here you have this Judith, just sort of pale and weak and seems to just not really know quite how the sword comes to go through there. And as for this spurt of blood, well, that's a bit silly, isn't it? But here, Judith, she has agency, she has determination, she has strength. There's an acknowledgement of strength. Her maid there has to hold him down. There's power here in this painting. And this is edgy Renaissance in a sense. And it's clear-eyed and it is brutal. And I will move on from this slide. But it's an important idea, I think, to take as inspiration. So when we think about this idea of Renaissance, it's rethinking our past as well as our future. You know more than any country about the importance of recognition of past. And that's really important here. And to be clear-eyed like Judith and to be able to face injustice and to avoid the easy wins of flattery. But then I do want to provoke you a bit and say, how do we think about Renaissance in a decolonial age? Well, we're also committed to decolonisation. Renaissance is very much the original one, not the Wollongong one. The original one is very much something of white Western males. So how do we engage with past and current injustices? And to end this section, speaking of Renaissance, inevitably really leads us into the world of the Enlightenment as well. The two are different, but they are related. So what about, if I ask that question, what about enlightenment in a decolonial age? And I refer here to, well, you can, this is my own copy, so you can see it's got coffee stains and everything on it. But Horkheimer and Adorno's book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, which Habermas referred to as the bleakest book of all critical theory, which is quite something, because if you've read any critical theory, it's all pretty bleak. But in a nutshell, and not to do it justice, it's the idea that in our quest, the dialectic of enlightenment was in our quest to have mastery over nature, we actually led to our own subjugation. Now, I just wonder what lessons there might be here for us, for you, if you don't mind me being part of you for this session, as we think about Renaissance and what it could mean at this time in history and at this time in your institution. So I'm going to pause on this slide. I suppose I should stop sharing for the chat, and would that work best? If I just pause here and for perhaps 10 minutes, does and start, obviously, if people have any questions. Right. Anybody have any questions or statements they'd like to make? I'm looking at the chat.
Okay. Jan, I'll just say with the slides on the screen that some of the voice is a little bit fragmented. It's obviously the bandwidth. It's good now.
Oh, okay.
So what I might be able to do is share the slides from this end, which might pull it off your bandwidth. But in the meantime, encourage people to ask Jan questions. Has anybody got any questions so far? I'm really interested in the idea that the Renaissance was a white male perspective. I hadn't thought of it like that before.
The original one, not yours.
No.
I'm just sending the slides to Anne at the moment. So hopefully, well, people are coming up with any thoughts, not questions for me. It might be your own observations too that you want to make. I think it's because I think I should have reduced the images in the slides, and that would have done it if I compacted them.
Okay, we've got Robin. I've just enabled your mic, Robin, so you should be able to unmute.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I hope my microphone's working.
Yep, can hear you fine.
I'm really enjoying your approach to this. One of the biggest challenges that I've seen in the past in other environments is when we're trying to make strategic changes and trying to look at where we're going, there is not enough consideration of where we are now. And so, you know, it's great to say you want to go to, if I talk it geographically, it's great if you say, I want to go to Melbourne. And everyone goes, yes, let's go to Melbourne. You've got to understand if you're living in Sydney or Perth before you know the road to get there, and understanding the othering that happens in that process if we don't all really understand where we are now and how we're going to get there.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And also even that sense that where you all feel you are now can be different. And so it's having to understand that as well. There's these levels of complexity. And I think one of the good things about what you're trying to do here is that you've created space and time. And that's really important, because there does take all of this takes time. But people who rush change, that's often where it goes wrong. And we know that so many change initiatives in higher education don't achieve their full potential, which may be okay. That may be normal, but I think it's worth bearing in mind too. And have you got my slides for the next section, or do I have to do anything else?
No, they haven't come through. I think it's, again, because of the size file, it's probably been parked. The joy of university systems, it's probably been parked due to the file size to be delivered afterwards. So
It will be.
Yeah, it's, so I think, Elaine's saying the sound was fine for her. So why don't you try and pick up where you were, and we'll see how we go with the next section. But
okay, I'm just looking. There's normally a thing to squish all the images down. I can't see it. Okay,
Yeah,
my apologies, everyone.
The people on campus seem to be having fine. So keep on going. It's just obviously some of us having trouble with sound where we are.
Okay, all right.
So go back to sharing. Thanks. Here we go.
Oh, resume presentation. Okay. Okay, so that was my part one. Really, I suppose some general ideas about change to throw out there. Now, in the second of my 4 sections, I want to talk about generative AI. And the first thing I have to say is that, you know, I always think of Socrates' concept of wisdom. Wisdom is knowing what you do not know. And when it comes to generative AI, there's an awful lot to not know. And I certainly am no expert in this field, I have to admit. But it doesn't mean we don't need to engage. So I'm going to, in this section, probably raise some concerns, but these are concerns I'm raising as part of a process of engagement, not to try and shut it down. So I hope that is fairly clear. There are some really weak arguments for using generative AI. And for me, these are that it's part of the real world, and I'll get to my obsessive dislike of the real world in a minute, and the idea that it's inevitable. And it really annoys me, particularly from a social justice perspective, when change is justified on the basis it's inevitable. Because what that does is it just takes all agency from us. We chain ourselves up. And one of the things that seems to me to be really important, whether you're an enthusiast or a doubter about embracing generative AI, is to remember and celebrate our humanity. And with our humanity is our agency. And with our agency, our responsibility for the decisions we make. So it is not good enough to say, well, we have to do this because it's inevitable. It's just the way things are going. No, you've got to have a really good reason. Now, there are good reasons. But what I'm just saying is, I just wanted to, this is very close thing between a provocation and a rant, isn't it? So let me just rest that there. But there are then, you see, we have to remember these really positive reasons to engage. And this is just one of many headlines we see. But, you know, the potential to do so much in the medical field. And I was talking yesterday with a student who is involved in foreign language learning. And, you know, he was talking about a really innovative way his university was using AI to enable a more personalised approach. But I want to strangely at this point jump over to this book that I came across once, perfectly by accident, about the Luddites. Now, the reason I'm doing this is, again, often when we talk about technology and we do that othering of enthusiasts and doubters, the doubters are the Luddites, aren't they? And, you know, that's it. You're silly old Luddites. Well, this lovely book, in the introduction, which I said I came across by accident and just started reading for fun. In the introduction, the editor explains that it wasn't the technology as such that the Luddites were protesting against. What they were protesting against was first the quality of the output, which they regarded as inferior to that which they could produce by their traditional means. And I think when we have this celebration of the Renaissance, it's worth remembering that we are celebrating the quality of output that only the skilled hand of a human being can create. This beautiful painting from Titian, we're celebrating that. And today we still love something like the idea of a handmade Stradivarius, or even if it's not just that, even if it's a handmade coffee cup that you get from your local farmer's market. While we haven't eschewed all industrialisation, actually the Luddites maybe did have something when they talk about the quality of the output, because that's exactly what we're talking about when we talk about Renaissance. And the other thing was the conditions of labour, that they feared that the conditions of labour would be worse under this industrialised system. Now, when we look at this as just one report, there's many. If we think about the scandal of the garment industry today, let alone all sorts of other things, the conditions of labour for many people in this world are atrocious. And that is part of industrialisation gone wrong. And I would also say, if we think about the conditions of labour of academics in the assessment field, it's pretty scandalous too, because I don't know any academic who has the proper amount of time to do this really important job of assessment. And that is something we have to address. So I just want to, again, as a provocation, put it out there that this is not me saying industrialisation shouldn't have occurred, and it's not me saying that we shouldn't engage with technology today. But let's think that maybe this idea about the quality of the output and the conditions of labour are something that we really do need to think about in higher education. And just on that, so when we consider generative AI, a really great book I would suggest people might want to go to is my colleague Paul Ashwin's manifesto, A Transforming University Education, which is an argument against so much of what we have become in this pursuing false notions of quality and league tables and ranking and skills over knowledge and all of the rest of it. It's quite a nice read. And I think if you read that, I'm of course not saying that my colleague Paul Ashwin is a Luddite. And I realise this is being recorded, and Paul, I hope, would have a laugh at this. But what I'm saying is I want us to have it part of our thinking about this initiative that you're undertaking should be to consider the quality of the output and the conditions of labour, and not to let those considerations fall aside. And yes, I agree. There's something in the chat I've just seen that the conditions of labour are not within the control of individual academics. That's true. But I'm hoping that this provocation will be seen by people in senior management too. And I suppose I'm speaking to them in part here. So then I think the other big issue that, and I always been part of the conversations you've had at Wollongong, is about the environmental costs of generative AI, particularly when we already have a climate emergency. And no form of generative AI is free. And we're now, I hope, familiar with the phenomenon of these huge data centres that then we need to have huge amounts of water to cool them down. And I just wonder whether, as a human species, we're sometimes slow to learn the lessons of history. You know, disposable plastics, for a long time, we traded convenience for a huge environmental debt. And that's a debt we're still struggling to pay. And we probably never will pay it. And it's a debt that is increasingly on the burden of those who are the least well off in our societies. So here, an image in Bangladesh, I think, of a sea of plastic bottles. And, you know, when we look back, were all those disposable plastics really worth it? if we had have thought it through. And here's another example that might seem a bit off field, and that's about helium balloons. Now I'm going to seem a real Grinch, having a complaint about helium balloons, but I want to think about the frivolous use. So the frivolous use of disposable plastics, the frivolous use of helium, and the frivolous use of Gen AI, and making a distinction between legitimate, necessary, and helpful use of Gen AI and frivolous, because it does have an environmental cost. So helium, you may not know, is a finite resource. Gen AI is an infinite resource, but the water that we need and the other resources to support it, they are not infinite. Now, so when I found out that helium was a finite resource, I got really cross about all these helium balloons. And I got even crosser about people who get drunk and suck in helium to make funny voices. Because helium is also used in really crucial life-saving medical procedures. But it's finite. Was it really worth getting drunk and making funny squeaky voices, and then we don't have enough helium for the medical resources we need? My first degree is in economics. It's all about opportunity cost. We do one thing and it has a cost of another. So it might seem a strange thing, but I do want to say that I think we need to think about frivolous use of generative AI and our responsibility in terms of any part of our life, not just generative AI, in the face of a climate emergency, to cut back on the frivolous consumerism and to think about others. And so, as I said, one plastic bottle, that seemed a convenient thing, no problem. One party with helium balloons, who's it hurting? Well, it could be hurting someone very dear to you. And so here, and when we pay that 5 cents or 10 cents, what is it in Australia now? I should remember, for that plastic bag, it's not about covering the cost of the bag. It's about the memory reminding us every day that there is a cost. And this is one of the problems with things that seem to come free. We do not remember the cost. And in making sure that you make just use of them, you have to account for that cost. So I'm going to end this section here and say, when we think about the use of generative AI as part of rethinking assessment in your Renaissance project, how do you think you can go about finding that boundary between frivolous and necessary use? There's no easy answer here, but let's see what ideas we can generate for the next 10 minutes. And I'll stop sharing there. Sorry, stop sharing there. So Anne, would this be something best done in the Q&A as a question, or just keep going in the chat?
Keep going in the chat at the moment. So we've got some comments in the chat. Monsi had put in, unfortunately, sector-wide labour conditions are not within the control of the average individual academic. And that's, I think, one of the issues with the whole sector is that perhaps a lot of the people making decisions they're far removed from the coalface. Yes, they were teaching academics at one stage, but it may have been many years ago when the conditions had changed quite significantly. And then, I've put in my issue is with peer review journals where we give free editorial work, free peer review stuff, and then are made to buy the product back. It's even beyond modern slavery. It's just, it's the most crazy relationship.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, but universities bought into that.
Yeah.
Clever people bought into what was a scandalous relationship in terms of free labour and obscene profits of the publishing companies. Yeah, I agree with you. Can I go back to the point about it's not in the control of average individual academic? Of course, that's true on one level. But at the same time, I want to go back to the idea that from a justice perspective, we can't cede our own agency. So I can't make it better. You can't make it better. Anne wants to make it better, but she can't on her own make it better with a magic wand. But it doesn't mean that we can do nothing. And I just have a strong belief that we shouldn't accept injustice. And I'll come to this later. But yeah, those in power now may have been academics at a different time. But I simply do not believe that they do not know that academics, the average academic, is up marking till 3 a.m., 4 a.m. to try and meet the marking deadlines, particularly on large undergraduate courses. They can't not know that. They can't. Well, if they don't, then shame on them. Shame on you if you're listening to this, because this really is a huge problem when it comes to assessment, is this time. I'm just looking at the other question about how do we put a fence around what one person considers frivolous and another necessary? Yeah, well, I think that in the conversations you are going to have in your workshops, that there is a place where most people can agree on frivolous and most people can agree on necessary. I think my argument for helium balloons is pretty good in terms of frivolous. Well, certainly making silly voices when you've had too much to drink. I mean, is anybody really going to defend that? So, we can find the extremes and then we can work to the others. And we won't have perfect agreement, and that we don't want that because it wouldn't be healthy. But you can. It's just important to have these conversations and not just keep on saying, well, everyone will always have their own opinion and we all won't always agree and we can't do anything. The purpose, as I understand it, of Renaissance Project is to have conversations that are meaningful and will take you somewhere. Oh gosh, right, okay. So a drug, yeah. And as I say, this comment that the first few years are free, it only seems to be free. It's just that certain people aren't bearing the cost. Nothing is free. A good starting point to identify what sort of students do we want at the end of the degree, yeah. And not only what students do we want, what do our students want to be? What do they want to be? And more than that, what does our society need in terms of the graduates? We have this incredible role that we're producing the trustworthy professionals of the future. And I think that might be a good place to start. How do we produce the trustworthy professionals of the future? Don't frivolity and play go hand in hand? Oh, that's a good provocation back at me. No, I don't think so. I don't think you have to. Or I could change the term frivolous to senseless, if you like. I was trying to be gentler. But I don't think for play we need to waste valuable resources. No, I don't. But again, I know you'll have this chat to refer back to, so I hope that might be something that you want to take up, because I think, Murray, if the implication of this question is the importance of play, then I fully understand that and I fully support you with that. I can't agree more. I don't have the name. Yeah. What students does society want? Yes, I agree. I think you can have ethical play. Yes, I agree. Yes, I'm glad we're. This is really nice, Anne. The whole idea of play, which I haven't mentioned, has come up in the chat as something clearly colleagues are valuing.
I think it's something too that relieves some of the overwhelming burden that we're saying falls on some academic roles, or sometimes with that late night marking, you have to do something a little bit crazy in the meantime to relieve the tension.
Yes, no, that's a really good point, Alan. In fact, it's very resonant with me. So I'm in a tiny village and there's a great big data center being planned up the road, and they're going to take water out of a river that doesn't have much water. I know, it's Scotland. How can you not have enough water? But anyway, to cool it. But there's been this really great work done that rather than big data centers, what we should have is small ones in the basement of buildings. And yeah, in cold countries, people need heating. So these are interesting ways, isn't it, of thinking around this. And I think what I'm trying to say is we were behind the play when it came to disposable plastics and so many other things that have led to the climate emergency. Let's not be in that situation when it comes to using Gen I. That's why I'm saying this isn't an argument against, it's an argument for, because unless we do it in this way, then actually we have to say, well, it's just we can't justify it. We can justify it if we find it ethical, if we have conversations about ethical use and boundaries of use. My prediction, for what it's worth, is that in years to come, we will look back and say, why were we ever doing some of that daft stuff? You know, and it's not just Gen AI, it's the same with us understanding the energy consumption involved in internet searches. You know, there's a whole area of education about our environmental impact that has yet to happen. And I think now is a really good time to start thinking about it. Anything before?
Sorry, there's a comment that's come through in the Q&A, Jan. We have 3 student partners that are part of our think tank that will be working together to explore these ideas further in follow-up workshops. And one of our students has posted something in the Q&A, which I think is fabulous. So if we could maybe read that, if that's okay. Your lecture made me think about the unconscious biases existing in AI and in educational content. Like the Renaissance, what do you think about the potential for Gen AI outputs to unconsciously inhibit biases that can affect this kind of othering, like perpetuating gender biases in its output? Even if lecturers can control the quality of the output, how can we ensure in this use of AI that we still have human discussions and dialogues about biases and how they exist in that content to empower people?
It's a great question. It's a great question. It's a whole different dimension. Anyone else feel free to chip in, but I'll have first go, if I may, and say that one of the things that we need to remember is that this sort of idea of othering and injustice seeps into many, many forms of information, and that we shouldn't think that if it comes from a machine, it's devoid of these things, because it's all come from some source. And AI isn't impartial or neutral or benign. No source of information is. So I think that the thing to do is that we should be, even with, this goes back to my point about the values and principles we should have addressed even before Gen AI. We should have been doing more. And I know there's a lot more happening now than there was when I was a university student. And a lot of this is thanks to things like decolonisation. But we should be already have been having more conversations about the fact that so much of what happens in terms of the information we receive, the things we read, the experiences we're subjected to are not neutral and they're not benign, but they're also not inevitable. You know, so that we can change these things and challenge them. I think Gen AI poses a particular challenge because it's huge and it's a little bit unknowable for most of us because it boggles the mind. but the same principles that are there with everything need to still be here, and is to understand this idea that we do exist in a society that is historically unjust, and that injustice is embedded in so many forms of information and so many places it's hidden in plain sight, you know. So I was showing my talk to my husband and he laughed at me. Well, he didn't laugh in a mean way, but he said, you can't really say buying a toaster leads to misogyny, Jan. And so I sat him down and I gave him a little talk about, actually, no, I can. I know it might seem silly, but the embedding these sorts of gender stereotypes then leads to certain forms of behaviour. And lo and behold, however many years, 75 years later, in the UK, we have a candidate from the party that won the most seats in the recent local government elections, the Reform Party, saying that women were only good for a limited number of low intellectual tasks in the household. Now, that thinking is still going on, that somebody who's running for public office can say these things out loud. So there's still a lot of work to do, and these injustices are buried in deep all over. And so your question is, yes, we just have to keep having these conversations. And you've got a lecturer who's had you thinking about that. Have you got other lecturers who haven't? Well, why haven't they? And I know it's hard as a student, but could you and student colleagues, you've now got to take the challenge back to your other lecturers and say, why haven't you been having me think about this? You know, you should have been having me think. And I'll come to it in a minute, and particularly in STEM, this idea that it's all neutral and benign is such a fallacy, and we have to redress that in all the conversations we have. And I think I'll pick this point up again later, Olivia, but thank you for raising it. Before we move on, just so I'd like a chance for anyone else who wants to come in here. Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Anne. Yeah, injustice will always exist. True, but we don't have to have as much as we have now. That's my position. It's still worth fighting for. And then when you do these transformations at your university, it's worth fighting for having less injustice, surely, would be my point. So if no one else wants to jump in, I will attempt to share again. Thank you, Tam. No, I keep going to the wrong thing. Okay. Resume. So, moving into the second half of this workshop. As I said early on, so much in the assessment realm that we now have to think about in the context of Gen AI, we should have been thinking about decades ago. Now, a small number of people were, but assessment has been, the reforms in assessment have not kept pace with what our research has been telling us about good practice. Let me just say that. Now, I have this idea that when we come to new policies and initiatives in higher education, sometimes what we do is we just keep piling new things on top. Oh, I went and saw somebody do this. That's a good idea. I'll add that to my repertoire. Or we'll add this. Or I know we need a policy on such and such. Let's add this. And let's keep, we could have a new strategy. And we keep adding them. But if you keep adding them and don't pare back first, it can become just a pile of unstable boxes. And so I think there needs to be some clearing the ground, would be my provocation to you, as part of the work of your workshops and other collegial discussions. Now, just to go back to the point in the previous section, I want to come clean here about, I created this image in ChatGPT a couple of years ago, because I was so worried about making sure I used images ethically. So I thought, well, I'll create my own, and then there's no doubt about it. But just as I was preparing for this talk, I thought, I wonder. So I went on Unsplash and I found this image, which you can get for free and acknowledge the person who's done it or make a donation. And it's just as good, isn't it, really? It serves the purpose just as much. So actually, when I look back on it, that was probably a fairly frivolous use. If I'd put a bit more effort into just seeing what online image I could get and use it ethically, I could have found one, but it was easy to create it. So I'm just owning up that I've done this, and these little examples add up and are part of, I think, the conversation you need to be having about how and when. And it's more than that about you having it. It's empowering students like Olivia that when they go out into society, into work, into schools or whatever, that they're thinking about these decisions about when and when not to use it. Anyway, so I'm going to have 3 points about clearing the ground. And the first is a little controversial for some of you, well, a lot, maybe. It is not being anti-technology to say that we should not use technology to absolve us of the responsibility to teach the academic craft and to assess it in honest, authentic and genuine ways. For me, this is a point on which I just cannot move. It is our responsibility that students are taught well and that they're assessed in fair and genuine ways. It's our responsibility. Whatever tools we use, the responsibility remains ours. And in my view, and I'm looking at Anne because I'm thinking, oh no, Anne and I might disagree here, but it doesn't matter if we do, because we're colleagues and we can disagree in a nice way. But my concern is that the way in which Turnitin has been used by some universities in some countries has ceded too much responsibility to the software to do the work of teaching the academic craft, and that it's made a mess of it, and that we have to make sure we get that right before we move on to something as big and powerful as ChatGPT. So what do I mean by this? The conflation of poor referencing skills with plagiarism. Plagiarism being the deliberate intention to deceive has been disastrous, in my view, for academic integrity, academic writing and authentic assessment. You know, too often the stories, if you sit on the bus and you listen to students talking about they've written their essay and it's pleased, Turnitin. The obsession that people have with proper referencing now. Now, I'm not saying referencing is not important, but when I was a university student back in the 1980s, if you say had an assignment in first year, these were the sorts of things that were important. Understanding the literature, critical analysis, clear writing and presentation, good referencing skills, and clear building of an original argument. How did we get to a point where we chose to criminalise one of these? Because that's what it feels like in the way this sort of software is used in a lot of countries for a lot of students, that they get caught out, they get caught, they get penalised, they get referred, they get reported. Back in the day, if you couldn't reference properly, you were taught to reference properly. You know, we wouldn't say to you, oh, Olivia, sorry, I don't think there's enough critical analysis here. I'm going to refer you to the academic integrity officer, and this is going to be a stain on your record. We wouldn't do that. We would just say, aha, this student needs some support here. And why have we done this? I'm sorry, I think we've done it because we got a for-profit company said it could help with a problem. And we thought, oh, that would be good because we're overworked and we're worried about this problem, and we'll just give a bit of this responsibility over there. Now, this is not an advertisement for Air Canada, but I want to say that in Canada, it's a thriving society. The planes are staying in the air. There's no particular problem with doctors, how they're their qualifications or teachers. Or society's running pretty well. In fact, if I compared it to the UK, I'd say their society's running pretty damn well. But the point is that Australia and the UK are particular examples of countries that have gone hard with plagiarism detection software. They don't use it in Canada, at least in most universities, and the planes still stay up in the air. The society is still working. Now, I'm aware that there are some people who are now academics who will never know a world without this because it was there when you were students. But there are countries in the world that flourish economically and socially without using this in the universities. And what that means is it's a choice. And it's a choice that now I think you need to make sure that your relationship with this sort of software is one that you're comfortable with before you embrace a further relationship with a far more powerful entity. And I happened to notice this morning, reading the Herds of Notices, that the ever wonderful Sarah Eaton from Canada is giving a talk on about the 11th of June on Imagine a World Without Plagiarism Detection Software. So whether you agree with me or not, I'd really strongly recommend you attend that talk if you can. I'm assuming it's online. So this is the first thing that I want to say. The first thing about clearing the ground. It's not about clearing away all use of plagiarism detection. It is about making sure your relationship with this form of technology is positive and just before going in deeper. So my next one. Okay. Towards genuine authenticity, I've already said I have a bit of a problem with this word term, the real world. Again, I'm probably in a team of one here, but listen to me out. We say real world often when we talk about assignments, and we're talking about like the economic world, jobs. But the world of the climate emergency is just as much a real world. And it's important to recognize that when we use this sort of language. And in an article I wrote recently, well, a couple of years ago now, I suggest that we rethink the concept of authenticity and assessment. And basically the argument goes that when people talk about real world tasks, they're often conflating it with the world of work. And that's important that we challenge that. The world of work is incredibly important to human flourishing and well-being, but it's not all there is to the world. And we know that as overworked academics, we know better than anyone that we want our world to be more than just the world of work. The other problem with this term about preparing students for the world of work is it makes it like it's external, it's out there. I don't know about the situation of your students, but students here, undergraduates aren't like the undergraduates I got to be, or even Anne got to be. You know, today they're working many, many more hours than is reasonable for a so-called full-time undergraduate. There's a cost of living crisis here. There's all sorts of things happening. There's the world just in crisis. Our students live in a real world, and it is disrespectful to suggest that they do not. So we really have to be careful with this language, because we really have to recognise the real world of our students, and it's a difficult world. And for most of us as academics, it's a far more difficult world than we ever experienced, particularly as an undergraduate. And the other thing is that this idea, because it's external, it makes it like something we can't change or our students can't change. They have to accept it. They have to just prepare for it. Well, that's not going to make the world better. You know, what we then quickly slide into is we've gone from talking about authenticity to talking about what employers want, or worse, what universities think employers want. And because we know that we always get it wrong, because the employers always tell us we're getting it wrong. And then finally, assessment for a compliant workforce. And a compliant workforce is not going to address the problems of our age. We don't want a compliant workforce. We want something better. So my third part of clearing the ground is that we need to have honest grading systems. We need to stop using cardinal numbers to represent achievement of a learning outcome or meeting a marking criteria, because it's using a number as a symbol of something the number doesn't actually represent. And we need to stop excessive grade differentiation. So these 2 points are related, but I'll just focus on the first one for a minute. Sorry if I'm teaching you all how to suck eggs, but this might be of interest to some. If we were doing a simple school test, or if you imagine a pub quiz, you might have 10 questions and they have right or wrong answers. And there's 1 mark for each question. So you then add up the marks and your final grade. So you get 7 marks, 7 things right, you get 7 out of 10, that's 70%. That makes perfect sense, doesn't it? But that's not what's happening most of the time when we give 70% in higher education, because we're about engagement with complex, dynamic and contested bodies of knowledge. Good assessment rarely has right and wrong answers unless we're talking about building block form, assessment of building block knowledge. But we do not add up the marks to get 70 points. And we know the frustration when the student who gets 50 says, the student who gets 48 asks, how do I get those extra 2 marks? And the academic groans, oh, they haven't understood. Well, of course they haven't understood. You're the one who gave it a number. If you're saying you've got 48 and the number to get is 50, it's only natural to ask about those extra 2 marks. But of course, in doing that, we have a complete misunderstanding about what grade boundaries really mean and what marking criteria means. And the problem is, if you give student 70% on, say, a dissertation, how are they meant to understand that that 70% is not equal to this 70%? Now, I realise that's a nonsensical statement, isn't it? How can it not be equal? But they're not equal. They're not the same thing. And that is not honest in an assessment thing. If we put a number to it, students are right to assume that there is a grade out of 100. So let me confuse you even more, maybe. I've confused myself when I talk through this. One of the ways in which a lot of academics overcome this problem of marking out of 100, it doesn't make any sense, we all know that, is to have step marking. So you have 50, 55 and a 58. Now we've kept the numbers, but what the hidden message is meant to be that one is a border, one is a medium and one is a high. So it's a qualitative judgment represented by number. But the numbers are still there, and so they don't make sense, because 55 as a mark you can get is 5 rungs from 50, but potentially only 3 rungs from 58. Okay, so you can already see that they're not evenly spaced. Well, it doesn't matter because they're just symbols. But it gets even sillier when you realise that 58 being 3 rungs from 55 is potentially only 1 rung from 60, because a 59 is a 58. But actually it's, can you see what I mean? When we treat the numbers as numbers, they start to become nonsensical. But what is your intention when you give one of these? And on what basis do you differentiate? Because this is my other concern with step marking. It seems a very reasonable solution to a practical problem. But how many people really have the marking criteria that distinguish them? And why don't we just share those words? The actual numbers have become symbols of something else. And what do our students see, though, when they see that number? What you see is what it's symbolising. What they see is the number. It's so socially ingrained. And I just worry, this is for me is one of the biggest injustices that we have to get right before we move on. And it all comes down to what I've termed the problem with how muchness. And I won't go into this too much here, but I can another time, is that we have, I think, excessive grade differentiation. We differentiate far more than we can in reality, or that we should. And it links to pressures for ranking and differentiation. So in the UK, it's all about degree classification. We need to spread student marks out so that we can add them all up so that they can get a certain, like a first class degree or a second. In the US, it's all about grade point average. And it's silly because you take numbers that are just meant to be symbols of something else, and then you add them up together, and then you average them. It's just bonkers on a logical level. And what's happening is that we're assuming that we're assuming that there are qualitative distinctions when sometimes things are simply different. Why do I have a picture of a dishwasher? Well, I have a long and happy marriage based on, among other things, the fact that I pack the dishwasher one way. And when my husband packs the dishwasher, he packs it a completely different way. He thinks his way is right. I think my way is right. I am right. But we coexist because actually the dishes get clean. It's a difference, but it's not a qualitative difference. And I think this is what we do. We force qualitative distinctions into our assessments when they don't need to be there because of the hegemonic pressure to rank and the societal view that we should have winners and losers. Why would we want winners and losers in education? And just think about it, the amount of academic labour that goes into excessive grade differentiation, even though the research evidence is clear that once you go beyond about 4 or 5, maybe at most, grade boundaries, the robustness of the marking reduces. So a lot of academic labour goes into moderation and this and that and all the rest of it. And why are we doing it? Why do we need this how muchness? Now, some of you might be thinking, well, Jan, actually, we do have a way of distinguishing things finally because we have rubrics. Okay, this is now another little rant. Rubrics, as they were first invented, are not the same as marking criteria. You can have just a few marking boundaries and have marking criteria. Rubrics, if we look back in history, have come in because of this excessive differentiation and the need to try and justify marks more and more and more. And they've been done with the best intentions, very student-centred, to try and break it all down and explain things to students. Here's an example of what I call my monster rubric, written by really good people trying to help, trying to make their marking accountable. So somebody sat down and worked out that 10%, this is for a history dissertation, 10% will go to development of the thesis statement support. And then they've worked out that only 8% of the mark will be development of scholarly conversation and 9% will be critical thinking content discourse. And then there's another 9% critical thinking integration of ideas. What the difference is between those two, I have no idea. And then you box people into, either one of 4 grades going this way. And this has been done to try and make transparent the process of marking so that you can justify students getting very different marks. But it's just bonkers and it takes all the joy. Can you imagine being the marker of this dissertation, which is, mate, it's on the French Revolution. It's full of drama and big skirts and gunfire and intrigue and sex and romance, and you try to work out all these categories? That's not what we should be doing when we assess. Assessment in higher education, where we're engaged with complex knowledge, we should be trying to enable our students not to atomize it, but to cope and embrace the big picture. And yes, there will be building blocks, just as an artist needs to use to learn the colours. But eventually the knowledge our students are engaging with is like a glorious painting. And excuse me, I've jumped out of the old Italian Renaissance into Australian art history with this beautiful painting. And if we imagine this as representing a body of knowledge, you have to understand the whole and how the parts interrelate to get it. And this is how we should be working with the forms of assessment that enable our students to embrace all the colour and drama, the light and the shade, not to break it into little bits so that we can better justify our marks and they can feel less scared, because it is scary, but it's joyous and adventurous, and that's what learning should be. So sorry, I'm going to pause there. So that's my clearing the ground before we go on. And what thoughts do we have? I wonder, Olivia, do you want to come in first? You don't have to, but, or I think we've got another 2 student reps as well, or student champions. Yeah, I'm sorry, is it Monty? Oh, there's Olivia. Sorry, I'll come back to the chat. Hi, Olivia.
Hi. Sorry, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, just did you have any thoughts on those 3 points I made there?
I was pretty shocked that you said rubrics aren't marking criterias, because I thought they were. So,
Well, I should say it's quite possible that some colleagues are using the 2 terms interchangeably.
right.
What I was trying to say, that historically they've emerged separately. Marking criteria existed for a long time, and they were generally about like between an A and a B. You know, they were sort of fairly big between, you know, a really great piece of work, a not so great, and etc. And then rubrics, because we then tried to add numerical marks, rubrics were then part of a process of trying to make that more transparent, all of those finer decisions, you know, between different levels and that. So it depends on the rubric. I'm critiquing the monster rubrics. If you've got a rubric that is working like marking criteria, then that's different. So this is the problem with the terminology.
Yeah. I can really see that, particularly in humanities subjects. But yeah, I think from what I guess Monty was coming from in the chat, it seems like there's still a lot of value for, I guess, what you would call those building blocks kind of rubrics or kinds of marking that I guess would be more numerically attainable than your examples of, I guess, more humanities subjects where it's almost impossible to kind of make a numerical number about where a student sits or where they don't sit.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this distinction between building blocks. So you could be a first year chemistry student and have a test about, you know, the names of elements or something. And, you know, there are right, wrong answers. And so you could add them up and get 70% and it would make perfect sense. And that's done. And I'm not criticizing that. But it's a myth that STEM subjects in higher education never go beyond the building blocks, because they do. And, you know, I've just come off the back of a 7-year project looking at chemistry and chemical engineering, which doesn't make me an expert on them, but it does mean I've worked a lot with colleagues in these areas to know that by the time they get to 2nd, 3rd, and in some universities, even in 1st year, they are also dealing with complex, contested and dynamic knowledge. Chemists all agree about what the basic molecules in the world are. But when you get up to the next plane of how you use them and you know, the use in the human world, that is a human subject. A chemistry dissertation in what we would call Scotland 4th year isn't full of right, wrong answers. It's full of more complex, nuanced things. So that would be my argument there. I think there's a lot of work. I think, yeah.
Thank you.
We need to bring STEM subjects, remind them that they're very welcome here in the human world, because that is where they belong and they've always belonged. But thank you for raising that point, because it's very helpful. Anybody else want to come in here?
Elena, I've just enabled your mic, so you should be able to unmute, and I'll fix Rosaline as well.
Thank you. So, thank you for the great talk and make us think about outside of the assessments and all of that. But and I was thinking whether I should ask the question or not, but because it is about the fairness and we are talking about justice, let's look at example where we have and we say, all right, we don't need marks, okay? Whether the solution will be pass and fail, satisfactory, unsatisfactory. And if we go with those two categories, let's say, I will say categories, then let's say that we have a student that is very diligent and it is really engaging into the learning and try to provide the best solution. And it is in the same category with the student that just want to pass the subject, so it's not so much engaging and putting so much effort, but they both will be in the same category. So I just want, as a provocation from the justice perspective, what is your opinion?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think reducing excessive grade differentiation doesn't mean we have to go to pass fail. I think that, you know, it is perfectly credible and even desirable, you know, to in some circumstances have exceeded expectations, met the criteria, not quite met, or something like that. But the problem is that the problem about diligence and effort and demeanor is a hard one, isn't it? Because I'm completely sympathetic to what you're saying, but then the hard-headed assessment person in me is saying, but we don't have learning outcomes for those things. We don't have them. We don't, you know, we might say in nursing have something about demonstrate a caring behaviour or something, but we don't have, you know, are you diligent or just in it for the marks sort of as a learning outcome? So then how would we assess it? But what I would say is that we have to stop thinking of that one mark as the only signifier of achievement, and that's where we get it. And so when I first moved into a pass-fail grading system, when I did my PG cert in teaching and learning, and I thought, oh God, I'm not going to get high mark. This is terrible, because I like to get high marks because that's who I was as a student. But then I realized that I could get this feedback that made me feel really good about myself, or feedback that made me think, oh, I didn't really try my hardest there. And so there are other forms of recognition other than the mark. And I think a mark is quite an empty signifier. And I would love it if our students were going home from university to visit mum and dad, and instead of bursting through the door and saying, I got 75%, if they said, I just learned something wonderful about plankton. I want to tell you all about it. You know, having a sense of achievement in the knowledge would be lovely. I would also say that in something like medicine, it's common not to give marks, because when you're lying, and people always say to me, when you're lying on the operating table, Jan, don't you want to look up and know your surgeon was the top in class? No, I want to know my surgeon has met certain criteria, because for all I know, that was a class of absolute idiots. I don't want a numpty as my surgeon just because they were less of a numpty than everybody else. You know, it's the criteria that have to matter. So I'm sympathetic to what you're saying. And, you know, the idealist in me, which I think this is also practical, would be to say we have to nurture the students who do want to care. But we have to also realise our students live in difficult worlds, and not all of them have the time to demonstrate diligence in the same way. So it's a conversation that has to be had, and I don't think there's any right or wrong here, but I do think that we can come to reasonable conclusions, and they may be different by subject. But I don't think at the moment that we are rewarding the nicest students necessarily with our marking. So, you know, you know, because there's all
I agree
sorts
with
of
that. Yes, I
privilege.
agree. But yes, and I like the way I like the piece when you were discussing the feedback. That's okay. But again, if it is the feedback, again, we are acknowledging that they were um, doing something, very good or beyond, the something that is good, but it is really good. It's something excellent and great. Yeah. Thank you.
So Rosaline next.
Yes, and she's one of our student ones. You should be able to unmute Rosaline.
Yes. Thank you so much for the wonderful topic that we are having here. One of my question is how can or what can be the governance structures or the student representations or any other escalation routes that could be in place to ensure we have fair decision making in assessment and with labor issues, if there is.
So fair decision making in assessment, so is in grading,
Yes.
and then the labour issues in terms of academic labour.
Yes.
Okay, and the governance structures. Okay. It's a huge question, but let me just some preliminary thoughts. I think in the assessment realm, we've made two mistakes when it comes to fairness. One is we've tried to do too much. And this is what I mean by excessive grade differentiation. The more different grades you have, the more you have to justify that it's fair to give this student this grade and this student this grade. And so those grade differentiations have to have a purpose. And the purpose can't be ranking, because even though society is pressuring us to rank, and our universities might be, and employers might be, our commitment is to criterion-based marking. So it's not to ranking. So we have to work out grade distinctions that matter and defend them. And I think that makes fairness easier, because there will be less to, it sort of links to Elena's point, there'll be less appearance of unfairness. So if you have, because each grade distinction is a potential act of unfairness from a student's perspective, isn't it? So if we don't really need them, if they're not serving a purpose, let's minimize that. Let's take the heat out of that sense of injustice so that we can focus our energies and our students more productively on better learning. And we know students learn better in a low stakes environment. So this would also lower the stakes. And there's a lot in terms of governance structures that would have to be done. And I'm too out of touch with university life in Australia. But I know in the UK, what I'm talking about would be just a minefield, because it would culturally mean abolishing the whole idea of degree classifications. And no one's got an appetite for that. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be talking about it. So outside of the UK and outside of the US, I think there's more opportunity for this, because those countries have got themselves stuck in really rigid places. In terms of academic labour, I suspect a lot of the governance structures are in place. They're just not being used properly. In that everybody, it's easy, but people, we have workload. I worry about newer colleagues who obsess about their workload model and if they got all the number of right allocations for everything they do, because I hate to see my job reduced to just a set of workload points, because it's a vocation for most of us and we love it. If we were only given enough time and space to stay in love with it. The problem is a lot of these workload models only represent, they don't allow you to go over, they don't recognise labour in excess of 100%, because in a way that wouldn't make sense numerically. So I think we have to have governance structures that are more honest And so, and I don't know, do you have like PDRs, performance reviews once a year or something like that, that are linked to things? You know, you should be able to tell your line manager that you have had to spend X number of days working at 3 a.m. to meet the marking targets. And they should have a responsibility based on their HR responsibilities, their commitment, their duty of care to your well-being. That is information that should go up the chain, and there should be somewhere for it to go, and there should be somewhere and somewhere and somewhere. And at the moment, we're just all suffering in silence. Not complete silence, because we all have a good moan about assessment. And like, why not? Because it is really tough sometimes. So there are governance structures in place that, if they were working better, would be recognising the exploitation of academic labour. Because I want to make it really clear that when I talk about assessment for social justice, it's about just assessment that is more just for students and for staff. Because if it's not just for one, it's not just for the other. Students would be appalled to know the workload allocation some universities give for, say, a 2,000-word essay. The workload allocation might be 10 minutes. Now, hopefully you don't have such a fine-grained one, but I know of institutions where that's the case. And, you know, I won't stop now, take up the time, but I'm hoping that students like Olivia listening are thinking, 2,000-word essay, how long did I spend on that? And the institution's only going to pay them for 10 minutes to look at it? No, that can't be right. But we know it is right. So I think there are some things there that could be fixed. I do also come back to the point, though, that, you know, those in charge aren't going to just do it on their own. It does require a grassroots thing. We have to think, as the academics who do feel that we're powerless, where are the opportunities to engage with change? And that nicely brings me back in to the Renaissance Project, because it seems to me, in fact, one of the things Anne told me was that anything could be put on the table, anything at all, about forms of assessment. Well, one of the things you could ask to be put on the table is for your managers to recognise the problems with the academic workload around marking more, and to take action. You know, it's on the table now. Anything can be put there. It's yours to put there. So that would be my sort of suggestion there. I don't mean that to be frivolous. I just mean, you know, like, give it a go at least, because it is a problem, and it's not just a problem for staff, it's a problem for students. And clearly what we need to do is clear out some of the assessments we don't need, and integrate assessment into the curriculum so that the spaces for assessment are part of the curriculum and not added on. So if I may, I'll go to my final section, which is meant to be the positive bit, but there's a fine line between what we clear out and what we add, with, you know, they're just two sides of the one coin in a way. But so if we go, so Renaissance towards assessment for social justice. And again, I have 3 points here. Yeah, I know they're given a fixed, sorry, Monsi, I must meet you one day because you're making great points here. Yeah, they're given a fixed budget, but are they using it wisely? You know, I don't know, business class flights, maybe stop them and pay the academics more. Just putting that on the table as an idea, which I'm sure is, I think, what you're trying to get at too. So if in effect, with this Renaissance project, reimagining assessment, you have a blank canvas. I think that's what Anne means when she says anything can be put on the table. You have a blank canvas, and that's amazing. And just think about what you can do with that, and think about being daring and brave. And I'm going to suggest 3 things, but this is provocations. It's not a final list or a shopping list. But the first one is to take higher education research seriously. And I don't mean this as a criticism of any of you, and I've put here, engagement with this research is more than parroting on about constructive alignment, and a little wink, because I hope you take that as it's meant. But My institution, Lancaster, was pivotal in the development of the field of researching higher education pedagogy as something different to other forms of education, as seeing the distinctive nature of university learning. And so since the 1960s, when that began, when my department began, there's been amazing amounts of research. But how many university committees do I sit in or visit, or strategies do I read that just pay lip service to it? We've got so much good research and so little of it is being used constructively. And I really hope this project is a chance for you to do that and to show to those senior up the importance. We're universities, we're research entities. Why aren't we using the research about teaching and learning more? So we have research about the relationship between assessment, learning and curriculum, the point I just made before, that assessment and learning are intimately linked, but they cannot have a positive relationship unless we also think in terms of curriculum and the places and spaces for them. We have research about academic integrity. We have research that shows that exams do not stop cheating. Yet over and over and over, I go to places that tell me, and I have my colleagues tell me, we're worried about students cheating, so we're going to bring back a traditional exam. Actually, the research shows students cheat more in traditional exams, or try to, than in coursework, because they're more stressed out by it. So there's a lot of research there. If academic integrity is as important as our universities are telling us, let's read the research. I mean, you've got Sarah Eaton giving that talk in a couple of weeks. You've got Phil Dawson there, his fabulous book From Cradle in Deakin. Then we have the emerging research on social justice, authenticity and assessment. It's not just me in this field now. There's a lot of people writing about this and thinking about different things. Vicky Hill at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, some fabulous work on compassionate assessment, research on pass-fail, trauma-driven education, and then student priorities and motivations. How often do you still hear the people say they're just interested in the marks? You know, they're only here for that. They, the othering of students, the calling them they and they only. And so on that point, I just want to share with you a couple of quotes from a research project I've already mentioned, which was a 4-year project following chemistry and chemical engineering students from first year for 4 years. And then we have a second project that followed them for another 3 years. So we have 7 years of qualitative data following their students. So it's incredibly rich. But I just want to share 2 little quotes to counteract that stereotyping of students as consumers who just care about getting, you know, what they're paying and what job they're going to get and all the rest of it. Here's Scarlett, a first-year chemistry student. So remember, these are all STEM students. If I want to go into research and if I want to change the world, if I want to change a problem in South Africa, I will have to study and get my degree and go further on. Her first-year transcript is resplendent with references to saving the world and social justice. This is as much a reality of the students we have as those stereotypes. And here from England is Harrison. Even if all I did with my life was contribute to a new hemorrhoid cream, I think the fact that I'd potentially be making a new medicine that is going to benefit someone else in some way is nice. Now, I know it's a sort of a funny quote. It's a genuine quote. And I want you to think of Harrison and of Scarlett when you're in conversations where people try and other students and say they're just in it for the marks or the money. Because, you know, Harrison wasn't. Huge debt, student loan debt. And still he's thinking about just making someone else's life a bit better and that would be nice. That's what he's in higher education for. So these are some insights from the research. My second point is to bring social justice and joy into our conversations and yes, even in our meetings. Why are academic meetings so boring when we're all so passionate? You know, and I refer here to, I have family in Ballarat, family that went to the institutions involved in the loud fence movement, which I imagine most of you are familiar with, and that these ribbons are meant to represent the voice of victims of sexual violence. And it's all about the importance of giving voice. So unless we talk about social justice and joy in assessment, how is it ever going to happen? And social justice is a deeply practical thing in my view. It's not a matter of blind hope or optimism. So where can we find the ways? We've done it today. Very early on, a few of you introduced play into the discussion. And look, and it was great. And we need to be prepared to do this, to not just have this as an afterthought or like icing on the cake, but to have it as the central ingredient of what we do, which is to think about social justice and joyful experiences of assessment. So in meetings, policies and strategies, don't confuse fair process with social justice. I'm not saying fair process doesn't matter, but fair process is not necessarily social justice. Social justice has to be about the outcomes. And don't confuse sameness with justice. How do you enable difference in these meetings? How do you celebrate difference and enjoy faux consensus? You know, that sort of, well, yeah, it's really important that we all agree to this. We all have to sign off on this memo. You know, do we have memos anymore? But you know what I mean. Joy and justice come through respectful disagreement and dissent, which isn't saying that we never reach decisions, but we should get to them through a path that is difficult and joyful and playful and considers social justice at its heart. And we must make time to talk about the intangible things, but which are very valuable. I think because we're time poor and there's so many demands on us, and because of social pressures, we often in meetings and policies and strategies focus on the tangible. And in a sense, that makes sense, doesn't it? But actually, what about those intangible things that have so much value? And again, I want to come back to that book about the challenger. So many of the people who tried to tell the powers that be that there was a problem, they were told that they were being un-American by perceived criticism. We don't want that to happen. We don't want people to be ostracized because they have a different view. We have to try and bring everyone in some respectful way. And yet I understand we still have to make decisions, but I think that we can think about this a little bit more. So how do we find the joy in assessment? So I think a lot of this requires program level design to create the spaces that I've talked about. So assessment methods that are genuinely suited to the knowledge or the task being evaluated. Time and space to enjoy engaging with the minds of others. Safety, forgiveness instead of fear. Better working conditions. I've missed a word off there, but I'm assuming it's meant to say happy staff equals happy students. So what can we do? Well, senior management, the message to you is this requires real solutions. You can't palm this off with a nice sounding strategy about workplace wellbeing when we don't have that in the assessment space. I think I've already said enough on that. For academics, share the moments of joy. I know it seems a bit like daggy to go and say, oh, you'll never guess, I've just read this student assignment or just seen this presentation or just marked this dissertation and it's so lovely. This student really struggled and, you know, it's not perfect, but they've done so well. Or here's this exciting idea from a student. We need to share this joy and we need to give permission to each other to be joyful and not to be seen as being a bit daft for doing that. Because don't let your new colleagues become disillusioned and don't let your older colleagues stay disillusioned and don't be disillusioned yourself. Because the one thing I know for certainty is that the academic job is hard, but it's even harder once you get disillusioned. And there's a lot that's wrong with the world we work in. But for me, you have to find a way to keep the joy alive. And don't forget your professional services colleagues. They might not get to see the presentation or read the dissertation, but they've been part of the student's journey. They've been part of supporting them. There has to be more to their work life than simply, oh gosh, has everything got to the right committee on time? They deserve more than that. They deserve to also hear these stories of joy because they've been part of making them. And finally, rethinking authenticity, which is something I've already mentioned. So in this article, I have 3 points, which I'll just mention very briefly. One is that we move from talking about the real world or the world of work to talking about society. Now, I've never been to Wollongong, so I really hope that my Google searching is correct and this is a picture of Wollongong and not Wollongong in Zambezia or somewhere, because the point of this image is that when you think about preparing students for going into jobs, we know that these things don't stay in little silos. When you go home, the world of work seeps into your house. It's there with you when you go to the beach, when you go to school, when you do this. It's part of being in society. So when we think of authenticity, let's think about the whole package, the society within which the work occurs. We need to go from the task performance to the value of the knowledge gained or the value of doing a task. And this takes me back to the earlier point that Olivia raised about STEM students. And when I said that as you go further on, it goes away from right, wrong answers. So we can teach an engineering student the principles of building a dam. But should they build it? We should also be teaching that. Now in South Africa, where this dam is, building a dam for water could be something that alleviates water poverty, which is a deeply racial issue in South Africa and a great issue of social injustice, and it could save lives. By contrast, some of the massive dams being built to power industry in Japan are destroying lives and communities. And in Australia, I hope all of you are familiar with the No Dams movement because it was a really important moment in Australian history. Some of us lived through it. But here's Lake Pedder in Tasmania, which was dammed over 50 years ago. And when there was the No Dams movement about whether to have a dam Franklin over Gordon or Gordon over Franklin, and the engineers of the Tasmanian Hydroelectric Commission were brilliant at building dams, but maybe not so good at knowing when a dam was needed and where was a good place to build it. So now there is quite a movement now to drain Lake Pedder because this apparently is great trout fishing. That's what you're into. But underneath it, it's a beautiful beach of pink sand and other sorts of wildlife. So the task of building a dam is one thing. The task of whether it's worth doing, the idea, the judgment is something else. And that is the heart of authenticity of assessment. And then finally, this is about from supporting the status quo to transformative change. If for me, authenticity is not to join the world that exists, but to contribute to the world that could be. And I think that's hopefully a positive place to end and for you to take forward in terms of the work you're doing with your Renaissance project. And just end there with a few of the images that may be helpful provocations for what you've got to take forward. I know there's been a lot happening in the chat. I'm going to stop there and we've got just under 10 minutes, I think, for our final discussion. And I do agree with the point somebody's made. We don't denigrate students for just wanting a grade. I didn't mean to say that that was wrong, that they shouldn't. I agree with that completely. I just mean that it's not true that that is what that's the only thing students want. So any provocations for me? Any ideas you'd like to share? Anybody want to ask somebody else out for a cup of coffee that you've never talked to before to talk about these things? If I was there, I'd say I'd buy you all a coffee and we could talk further. Maybe one day. Monty, I think you should have something to say because you've been fab in the chat, really challenging and engaged. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Jen. Everybody in the room probably knows me as someone who likes to ask questions and issue provocations back. Yeah, I guess one of the last slides you mentioned there around focusing more on the acquisition of, and you said knowledge, but I'm guessing knowledge, skills, or learning. And I guess the issue that academics are having now is that in this AI world, it is getting harder and harder to evaluate whether a student has indeed achieved that additional knowledge, skills, or any form of learning. In that, when a student, submits an assessment, it is getting harder and harder to determine whether a student has spent 5 seconds on that assessment, 5 minutes, 5 hours, or 5 days. And so the 5 seconds option is downloading the assignment question, putting it through ChatGPT and putting the response straight back in. 5 minutes would be to download the assignment specification, put it through ChatGPT, actually review what ChatGPT said, spend 5 minutes doing that, but upload that as well. The 5-hour version might be think about the question yourself, get AI to do most of it, but do some work. And then the 5-day version might be actually do it all yourself. And that we do have some conscientious objectors, actually. We have some students who, for environmental reasons or for a number of reasons, refuse actually to use AI. And so the issue, but I guess the point I'm trying to get across is that academics are seeing, and as AI becomes more and more indistinguishable from human endeavour, it is getting harder and harder to evaluate whether the student has actually met the acquisition of new knowledge, skills, or learning of some form. So I guess, what is your solution to that?
I'd be very rich indeed if I had a solution to that. I could just say, I've got a AI detector. Pay me hundreds of millions of pounds for something that doesn't work, as our universities paid Turnitin for their AI detector, which didn't work. Anyway, just had to say that. There's a lot in this question, obviously. A few thoughts. When I first started talking about assessment for social justice, one of my strong pillars was about the idea of trust. And this was long before Gen AI. But I worried about that we had industrialised mistrust in the assessment place. And some of the big names in assessment research made fun of me at the time. Oh, that's a bit silly, Jen. Assessment and trust. But actually, that's where the discourse has come back round to. Because in the face of AI, and knowing that these detectors are rubbish, we don't have much left in our armoury other than trust. So a big thing of what we have to do is 2 things. I did say it at the start, Alan. Anyway, I just got distracted by the chat there. So there's 2 things. One, we have to have assessments that don't. Why are we having assessments that lend themselves to that 5-second solution or the 5-minute or even the 5-hour? Like, what are we trying to assess? And is that form of assessment working? But secondly, I think the biggest thing, students are the answer here, not the problem, in that we need to educate our students. One of the things about AI at the moment, things written by AI, just the same as with essay meals. And if you go look at Phil Dawson's work on it, you could often find an essay meal something, not because it's the best thing you've ever read, but because it's sort of okay, but strangely crap, And our students don't realise that when they cede the responsibility to someone else, they're not necessarily getting the good work. They could be getting something that's oddly crap, but maybe sufficient. And I don't think many students, that's what they want. So I think that we have to do that. We have to work with students in tandem with thinking more carefully about what a genuinely authentic assessment is, a meaningful assessment that is graded meaning in a meaningful way, to build in more time and space to take assessment seriously, which, for example, would mean building in things for preliminary submissions of larger pieces of coursework, so you see the work developing, and that would be that is one of the best ways to actually know about the student. Knowing our students, anonymising marking, which was student-led initiative, is one of the worst things for academic integrity and in the end for our students, which I know is a whole other discussion. And I know a lot of students don't agree with me because they are worried rightly about biases. But knowing our students and working with them on meaningful assessments, fewer assessments, more meaningful ones, but educating students. I do think that the students we have today, the undergrads, are going to look back when they're my age and think, why did we waste all that? Why did we do that to the environment? Why were we so wasteful? They will look back and think, my goodness, I'm so glad my granny is going to be helped by that medical initiative that's come out of Gen AI, or this better way of teaching that's come out of. They will see those, but they'll see a lot of waste. And I don't think looking back they'll feel that comfortable about having been part of that waste. So I think there's a number of conversations. So one is the environmental, but the other is we have to give them back the joy of doing the work. Now, my colleague Margaret Bierman, who many of you would know at Cradle, there's a project I'm like one of the advisors on, which did look at student use of AI. And one of the early findings, as I recall, was that students who contract out their assessment, be it to whatever, Gen AI, SA Meal, their uncle who's got a PhD in whatever subject they're studying, because that happens all the time, and there's no detector for the clever auntie, essay. That students contract it out when they don't see the reason to do the work. So when they see that this is just something we're told we have to do, everyone has to do a presentation, blah, everyone has to do this, everyone has to do this, or some blah, blah, blah. But when they see the meaning, the purpose of doing something, because most students are, even if they are quite rightly, I'm here to get a job and all of that, but they've chosen to do chemistry rather than English literature for a reason. Often they do have something there they quite like about it. We've got to play to that. Where is the joy in your learning? And make it low stakes and make it worth achieving for themselves. Sorry, I'll let you have the final word there.
No, I really like what you said about having the joy. Unfortunately, the joy of my personal belief is that the joy of learning is something we would all like to have in life, but many students find themselves that I could achieve the joy of learning this week, or my bank balance is so low that I'm going to take 2 extra Uber Eats shifts because otherwise I can't put food on the table. And then, you have these kinds of almost rationalization occurring because of the situation that students are in. So students are in much harder, difficult situations. I mean, I got through university with a Thursday night part-time job and a Saturday day part-time job. So that was enough. Between that and, I'll study or whatever it was called back then, I was able to get through my university degree. And the reality is now students are working 3-4 different part-time jobs and a side hustle. And, you've got we've expanded access for university, which is, to university, which is great. But that, you've got the single mother of 4 kids who doesn't have a lot of time. And so this is why I made the comment, we shouldn't be denigrating students who are really here to get a degree in the minimum time possible. And I guess I find that hard to then balance with what I said earlier around how do we adequately evaluate student learning. Yeah, that's the difficult conundrum.
And I agree completely. And I think this goes back to the point Rosaline made about governance. We have governance structures that assume a typical undergraduate, the picture that have the idea of a full-time undergraduate is a myth. And we've got to address that. Firstly, when we think about this, is why I say fairness isn't about sameness. It drives me mad that people think it's fair. Why is it fair to have all essays on your desk at the same time? Because you can't mark 100 at the same time. But we've made a choice that is fair. And yeah, there's arguments for and against. But equally, the single mum with 5 kids working 2 jobs, why should she get hers in at the same time as the wee lad who's 18 years old home and mum does all this cooking and cleaning? You know, like there's different questions we could ask about what is fair and just. But coming back to where we started on joy, given that they're paying these enormous fees, given how hard they're working, and given on a practical level, we know that we learn more in joyful, low stakes environments, how can we not let them have joy? I'm not saying this is not frivolous. This is about saying it's our task, and it's the challenge, I think, of your Renaissance project to think how, given that new student type you have, or the variety of student types you have, how can we fulfill our obligation as educators in this difficult space? So I'm really glad you raised that, because it's absolutely true. But I don't think it means we don't try, because on a practical level, these graduates will have better knowledge if they have not come through an incredibly narrow instrumental education.
Oh, I think the frustration is because academic staff are trying to make learning opportunities available and then not being taken up, and you can't mandate it then. And then, yeah, so that's where my question came from.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why I think, Anne, you have a great series of workshops and other activities, and nobody's naive thinking that this is going to solve everything, but you know, you can make things better or even make things less bad. But let's go for better.
Yeah.
Shall we go for better? Will we end on that point that we're going to try for better?
I think that's such a great point to end on, Jan. And I know we've gone just over 6 o'clock here. And I thank those who've been able to stay all the way through. We know that some people pick up on the end of the conversation on the recording, which is great. Thank you so much, Jan. And I think such an amazing way to end our provocation series, really provoking us to think about what we need to do and how we can help the students make the world a better place. Better place for everyone. So thank you everyone for joining us. Elise has put the feedback form in the chat as usual. We look forward to seeing think tank members next week, but want to encourage that the conversations keep going on. So thank you everyone, and I wish Jan a great day in the warm weather that's happening in the UK at the moment, and to everyone here a good night and stay safe.
Thank you all for having me. Hope to meet you in person one day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Jan. Thank you, everyone. Bye.